Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to yet another RedGamingTech.com video, which is going to be taking a look at the AMD Jaguar, which is, of course, the heart of both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox 720, also known as Durango. It is the heart, as in it is the CPU, so without further ado, I, Crimson Rain, will be taking a look at this. Now, I've very much been in depth with the PlayStation 4's specifications, and indeed have also taken a look at the Xbox 720's rumoured specifications. I use the word rumoured because obviously they're not confirmed yet. And one of the things that we definitely do know about both systems is they are going to be using the new generation of AMD processors, well, at least for low power devices, which is once again the AMD Jaguar. Now I'm going to be doing a very specific video, of course, this one, on this processor, because I've had a few comments and messages and so forth asking me what exactly is the deal with the processor, what type of performance are we going to be expecting, and so forth. So before we jump into the processor itself, I'm going to very quickly go over the details we already know. Now, I know I've done this a few times before, but I just want to kind of echo what we know. We do know the PlayStation 4, and I'm going to be primarily focusing on that system in this video. Although the processor itself is used on Xbox 720, and we're pretty darn sure of that. But I want to focus on the PS4 because the rest of the specifications are known. So what we do know, of course, about the PlayStation 4 is it's going to be using a custom AMD GPU as well as 8GB of GDDR5 RAM. More to the point, we know roughly the memory bandwidth of the memory, and we also know roughly what type of kind of computing power the graphics card has. It's just under 2 teraflops, just for your FYI. However, there have been less details on the AMD Jaguar. Now, what we do know about the AMD Jaguar, of course, is that it is a low-power, made for low-power type of devices. So, to give you an illustration of that, it would be low-power notebooks, or, for example, smartphones, or possibly things such as tablets. You get the general idea by now. Now, for all intents and purposes, the PlayStation 4 derivative of this has gone with a few changes compared to the, how shall we say, the classic Jaguar. And that isn't to say there are tons of devices using this already. One of the changes that we're going to get into straight away is the amount of Jaguar units. Now, each of these cores acts independently. And what we do know is there are 4 level 2 data banks, 2 megabytes total. Now, each of these cores are independent, but obviously the PlayStation 4 and we believe the Xbox 720 has 8 of them. Therefore, there are basically 2 sets of these 4 units, if you would call it that. Now, from what I understand of the PlayStation 4 derivative of this chip, it has been, well, custom designed to a degree. Now, the AMD Jaguar itself is x86, whereas the PS4 derivative does indeed have 64-bit addressing. Sony have called this x86/64. Now, that isn't to say that the Jaguar is the first of the new kids on the block from AMD. It is actually a redesign of sorts, anyway, of previous chips, and indeed has improved on what was known as a Bobcat beforehand. There have been a number of improvements from Bobcat. One of them is more IPC. Now, IPC, or instructions per clock, you can think of it almost as efficiency. Think of it this way. Let's say you as a worker are able to do one task, right? But then let's say you are given training so you can do, say, a task every, let's go with 40 minutes rather than every 1 hour. Therefore, you are more efficient at your job. And CPUs are very similar in this regard. Obviously, I'm simplifying this a little bit, but you get the idea. Similar to this is a better frequency at a given voltage. Now, if you guys aren't really familiar with the whole CPU architecture, I will be doing another video, actually, which is going to be going really heavily into this stuff. But suffice to say, there are a number of things which really dictate how fast a CPU can go. One of them is heat. One of them, of course, is just how the thing was designed. This includes manufacturing size, this would be the NM of the chip and so forth. And one of them is the voltage. Now, example of that, if you really want me to be completely blunt, let's say you have a CPU in your PC. I was about to say CPU in your processor, that was completely wrong. So anyway, let's say you have a CPU in your PC, and let's say you want to overclock that. Generally speaking, you can indeed overclock it at default voltage. Let's say, for example, let's just use arbitrary numbers here, and let's say your processor runs at 2 GHz, and let's say it requires 1 volt to do so. And let's say that you want to overclock that to say, let's say 2.1 GHz. So in other words, about 5% performance boost, or 100 megahertz. Okay, you may not actually require more voltage. In other words, in the BIOS, you may not require to pump more voltage through the chip for the chip to operate at that efficiency. In other words, at that frequency. I'm sorry. However, let's say you wanted to turn that up a bit, and let's say you wanted to go at, say, 2.4 gigahertz or 2.5 gigahertz. In other words, a reasonable jump, say 400 to 500 megahertz jump from the clock, the default clock, shall we go with. In which case, you're probably going to have to go into the BIOS, and you're probably going to have to put more voltage through the chip. So in other words, AMD's goals on this was not to do that. Their goal was basically to make the chip run faster at that voltage. There's a very, very, very good reason for that. It uses less power, which is very good for devices that aren't necessarily the PlayStation 4. For example, remember those tablets I was telling you about? Well, you don't necessarily want your battery to be getting, requiring a charge every 5 minutes, do you? You want it to last as long as possible, but you do want it to be more powerful than the previous generation. Therefore, the best way for that is to operate at a faster frequency at a given voltage, and therefore requires less power. The second benefit of this is that the more voltage you put through a chip, naturally speaking, the more heat it's going to produce. So those two are kind of the same reason, but you get the general gist of it. What this basically means is you've got about 15% higher efficiency of the new cores versus the previous cores, in other words, the Bobcat. More to the point, there is various other improvements which reduce the amount of power required. And this is done through various means, including a unit redesign and what is known as clock gating. More to the point, there is improved instruction sets on the CPU itself. Now these include, and I'm not going to go through every single one because there's quite a few, but these do include SSE 4.1, SSE 4.2, AES, PCL, MUL, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all of them, there are a number. There's a reason that this is very good. One of them is that it makes it a lot more like a PC. For example, SSE has been around, at least derivatives of it, for a long time now. These were basically put about in 1999, if memory serves, and they were introduced from the Intel Pentium 3 series. This was actually, ironically enough, from AMD's 3D Now technology, which was brought about in the K62 kind of era. And it somewhat took over the previous standard thing from Intel, which was the MMX derivatives. Although they still kind of exist, it's mostly now SSE. Now, there have been a number of other improvements as well from the processor. This does include 128-bit floating point, or FPU, with enhancements and double pumping to support 256-bit AVX instructions, as well as innovative integer units with hardware divider, large schedules, and out-of-order resources. Now, before we dive into this any further, I want to give one of the reasons that the x86 is a very important thing to note, shall I say. One of the reasons that the x86 is incredibly important is quite simple. It basically means that it's going to be so much easier to develop games on the PlayStation 4, and more to the point, it's going to be a lot easier to optimize games from the PlayStation 4. More to the point, even further, for those of us who are PC gamers, it means that there's going to be less development time porting a game to the PC, and less development time porting a game to, say, the PS4. One of the issues with developing cross-platform games is, generally speaking, the CPU architectures are extremely different, and this can lead to, well, piss poor performance. It's going to be a lot less of an issue now. So, in other words, it's going to be a lot easier for smaller developers who are, say, more used to developing for Windows-based machines, in other words, or Macintosh indeed, modern Macintoshes anyway, than what it was the PlayStation 3. Now, the PlayStation 3 used a 6-core cell processor. This itself is very important because it means that smaller developers are therefore going to be a lot more able and a lot more confident with their porting. One of the issues with the PlayStation 3 is inefficiencies in terms of the code. In other words, there could be some errant code in there. It causes instabilities, or it could cause crappy performance simply because it was a bit trickier than what it really should have been to program for. This wasn't really helped, by the way, by the memory configurations of various other bits and pieces on the system. So I know what you're going to say, okay, that's nice, but what about the actual performance? What type of, real performance are we going to be seeing? Right now, we know there's going to be a development conference in March, and they're going to be really going over the very, very, very in-depth specifics of it, and therefore I'll definitely be producing a second video then. However, in this video, I'm going to be going primarily over what we do know for certain right this second. Now, I've mentioned before that one of the benefits of the PlayStation 4 is the fact that it does have 8 processors, or at least 8 cores, and this means that they'll be able to very much be able to optimize the games to a far greater degree than what they have previously. They'll be able to kind of shunt data around as necessary. Another thing about the system is obviously it's closed source. However, there's a very good chance this CPU, in terms of raw performance, will not be able to kind of keep up with a modern day system. In other words, if you were to somehow or another rip that CPU out, stick it onto a desktop kind of test bed, run it to applications to test the performance of both chips, there's a very good chance the PC kind of traditional chip would indeed easily win out. However, you've got to also remember that at the end of the day, the system isn't really designed to do that. It's not really supposed to be a direct competitor to, say, oh, let's go with Intel Sandy Bridge or the newer Haswell when it's being released sometime this year. You've also got to bear in mind the cost of the system. Now, we do know that there has been some major changes with the GPU, and indeed it seems to be almost certainly built from the 8000 series Southern Island. So what does that actually mean for us? Well, the first thing is it does mean a massive jump in the CPU power from, of course, this generation of consoles. But one of the primary benefits of the new generation of PlayStation 4 and of course Xbox 720 is going to be a greater portability, and by portability I don't mean the console's going to fit in your briefcase better, I more mean that a games developer will better be able to produce games on that system. This is going to be absolutely fantastic for developers who are newer to the system. Let's say, for example, you've been not necessarily a bedroom programmer, but let's say you've had some minor success with Steam games, say Steam Greenlight, that type of thing. And let's say you're looking at the PlayStation 3 and you might think, that looks a bit tricky to program for. I don't have a clue really where to start. And of course there are some common grounds on any system you're going to program for, but there are also a lot of challenges that are unique. Now, with this approach, obviously there are still going to be some unique challenges due to the fact of the amount of cores on the particular system. I very much appreciated what Sony have done. Regardless, as I was saying earlier, there are going to be some challenges with this whole situation for developers. Remember that at the moment the average, desktop CPU, that would be the one in your PC for example, is only, say, tri-core, possibly quad-core. But those cores themselves are probably going to be significantly more powerful. So there's still going to be that little bit of a challenge to, of course, port the games over. Regardless, it's still going to be significantly better than the current situation we have right now. For example, the Xbox 360 indeed has a tri-core system, although this is an IBM derivative and is, of course, a power PC base. So with all of that said, there are going to be a number of challenges still. Right now, of course, the actual clock speed is also somewhat questionable. Right now it seems that AMD have gone, should I say Sony have gone with a 1.6 gigahertz. It is worth noting that the previous iteration, of the processor. Now, the Bobcat was known to have a clock speed of around 1.7 gigahertz, but no turbo core. It appears that, for the most part, the Jaguar cores are going to be a 1.9, possibly 2 gigahertz, depending upon the device. However, as I've said previously, this is not the case for the PS4. It seems that this is going to be running at 1.6 gigahertz, so a little bit slower. One of the reasons for that, of course, is power and heat that we've mentioned previously, as well as yields. Yields are, well, very simple. In other words, the higher the clock speed you want to run the processor, the more likelihood that that processor won't be able to reach that speed. In other words, let's say in a batch of, let's say you produce 100 processors and you want them to reach 2 gigahertz, it could be that, let's say, I'm going to use arbitrary numbers, but let's say 75 of those processors actually make the speed grade. In other words, they're able to physically run at that particular speed. Whereas on the other hand, if you lower the gate a little bit, if you say, hey, you know what, we actually only want it to run at, let's say, 1.6 gigahertz in this case, it could be that 90 of these processors will make the grade. In other words, you're going to have a lot more processors that are going to work. This is great because it allows you to put the console out a hell of a lot faster, and also reduces the manufacturing cost for a number of obvious reasons, which is great for, well, both AMD and Sony, of course. So with all of that put together, we know that there are going to be some significant changes on the PlayStation 4 core. We're not exactly sure of all of them. I think some of them are going to be announced to the members of the public, in other words, you and I, when the development conference comes around. But what's probably also going to happen is, much like the Wii U, there's going to be a series of people buying the console, ripping it apart, taking it kind of to the ninth degree and really kind of checking out every single component on there, because of course there are still some parts of the system as well. To be fair, we don't even know what the PlayStation 4 looks like, let alone anything else right now. But right now what we do know is this range of processors are going to be extremely power efficient. We do also know that it's going to be extremely similar to what you would see on your desktop. This is going to be extremely excellent for developers, for game developers, and for software programmers, because it will quite simply allow you to be able to really utilize the technology a lot easier, to get the most out of the hardware a lot easier. So in other words, you don't have to kind of overcome that massive technical hurdle. The PlayStation 3 that I've mentioned before previously, there are some developers, for example, those who say put out Uncharted. You remember how awesome some sections of both Uncharted 2 and 3 looked. One wasn't too bad either. But of course there was a number of strides made forward with those two titles. And of course this happened with Killzone, Resistance, and various other, of course, PlayStation 3 exclusives. And one of the ways that they got around this, the limitations of the console, is, well, to be honest with you, programming tricks. They learned everything to do with the console. This is a complete aside, by the way. This is very similar to what actually happened back on the Sega Saturn, which of course was a 32-bit console back in the days of the PlayStation 1. It was actually a rival to it, and one of the problems was I believe it was gored shading, and the system really couldn't handle it that well, and therefore 3D games on the system looked decidedly worse than what they did on the PlayStation 1. However, clever developers and even certain exclusive games, for example, Exhumed, or I believe in America it's called Power Slave, although I'm not 100% certain on that. It was built on the Slave Driver engine, and the Sega Saturn was actually an extremely complicated machine for its time. It actually had 2 processors and 2 graphics card cores on the system, and this is wrapped up with 2.5 megabytes of RAM, so this is really cutting edge stuff. And back in the day, of course, you could actually have a memory expansion on that as well to give you an absolute gargantuan 6.5 megabytes. I know you may be kind of scoffing a little bit, but this was actually really impressive back in the day. And what it turns out is that despite the fact that the CPU of the PlayStation 1 was actually significantly easier to program for, and was actually a little bit faster. If I remember correctly, the PlayStation 1 CPU was 33 megahertz. I'm pretty certain of that. This is completely from memory. I don't honestly have a Wikipedia page or something up. And the Sega Saturn CPUs happen to be 25 megahertz each. I believe they are RISC processors. That's R-I-S-C. And basically what the developers did, and this is actually lobotomy software, and they actually ported Exhumed to the PlayStation 1 later date, but they also ported Duke Nukem 3D, as well as Quake, by the way. And it turns out that those versions of the game are actually better than the PlayStation 1's in many reasons. And it's quite simply that they basically split the load on the processors. I can't remember exactly how they did it, but I did read an interview back in the day, and they were basically saying that one graphics card or one graphics processor along with one CPU was in charge of drawing sprites and various other bits and bobs, and another one was in charge of drawing like the scenery and everything else, and it worked out extremely well. What I'm basically saying to you, and I kind of jumped off topic there, I tend to do that a lot, but you guys don't seem to mind, which is good, is that clever programming can get around quite a lot, and they certainly did do it with the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 as well. That isn't to say that Microsoft get off scotch-free on this. It certainly did have a number of limitations that I've mentioned on previous videos. If you guys want to check those out, you are more than welcome. Regular viewers have probably checked these out already. However, what I am saying to you guys is that with the PlayStation 4, it's going to be a lot easier to access this. That doesn't mean that in, say, 3 or 4 years' time, there's not going to still be programming tricks to learn. They're probably going to better find out how to use the cache on the system, how to better stream data from the hard drive to make various areas better, and of course there's going to be a number of system improvements as well on the PlayStation 4. For example, for all we know, there could be, say, driver-based improvements and so on. As you guys may know, let's say one of the easiest ways to get free performance out of your PC would be to simply update the drivers, and there's a good chance that graphics card drivers as well as motherboard drivers alone are going to net you quite a bit of performance increase, and this was noticeable on, say, AMD and Nvidia. Nvidia, for example, released a series of drivers for both Crysis 3, I believe, as well as Far Cry, and they've kind of ramped up the performance across the board. That doesn't mean, of course, that you infinitely get to do that, but for a certain degree you can, and that's one of the reasons, of course, system updates do exist. Regardless, I think I'm kind of waffling off from the point now. As I was saying previously, there are going to be a number of different improvements on the Jaguar kind of base technology, as I've kind of briefly summarize it. Much better power gating, far better efficiencies clock for clock than the previous generation. We're also going to, well, that's Bobcat incidentally, we're also going to be looking at 8 cores rather than the traditional 4 of Jaguar. Of course, these are kind of tied in by 2 clusters, although they do seem to be running a little bit slower. You've got to bear in mind, however, it's not going to be using the traditional Bobcat or AMD Jaguar APU. It's instead going to be, of course, using that good old AMD graphics card, which is going to be next generation. That's going to have about 2 gigaflops of performance on it alone, which is going to be more than sufficient to run most games in 1080p, and it's going to be quite happy to do so, might I add. Anyway, I think I've waffled on to the point where you guys have probably understood most of this stuff by now. As I said, I will be releasing another video in March, which is going to confirm quite a lot of the specifications in terms of what type of actual performance is going to be versus desktop. As I said right now, from my understanding, it certainly isn't going to be rivaling, say, 2013 processors, and probably not even 2012 processors, but it's very difficult to understand that 100%. Regardless, anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video, and I will see you around soon. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.